Professor Himla Sudial, because of personal reasons, just cannot be here at this time in point. So it is me that will take you forward in these different discussions and introduction to the actual webinar. So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm so glad to see so many people on this call. It's great to have you all. I think it's very important that we just start giving perhaps a little bit of background to the statement. And I hope that you've all seen the actual statement. If not, what we could do is then after our meeting, we could send it then to everybody to actually just be ensured that you all have some input into this particular statement. So this statement actually has a very long history, 4 years, where we started with various reiterations to bring it about and then to actually have it approved by our council about a couple of weeks ago. So this statement is called the ASSAf Statement on the Recognition of the Work of Editors and Peer Reviewers of Academic Journals and Books in South Africa. So it was initiated by the Committee on Scholarly Publishing in South Africa, and the need for formal recognition was highlighted during the 2021 National Scholarly Editors Forum NSAF meeting in Shaw. So a team of experts drafted the statement, which was circulated to the NSAF and independent reviewers for input. And it's also then in this case that I would like to acknowledge the authors that brought the statement about, namely Professor Philip de Jager, Professor Leslie Swartz, Professor Keyan Tomaselli, and Professor Robin Cruz. So thank you very much to all of these authors that persevered, because it really needed some perseverance. So in February 2024, the statement was submitted the first time to the ASSAf Council, whose feedback helped refine and shorten the document. And then the revised version was shared with ASSAf members. And while most feedback was positive, some concerns were raised. It wasn't an easy road. There were some obstacles and some challenges. But these were addressed in the updated draft, and therefore then the statement was then approved in October 2024. For those who do not know me, my name is Susan Veldsman. I'm the Director of the Scholarly Publishing Unit at the Academy of Science of South Africa. If I look at the participants, there's many of you that I do know and many of you that I don't know. So be greeted and welcome then to this particular meeting. And please feel free, we will later on enter into some discussions. So please jot them down and be ready once Professor Keyan Tomaselli has given us his speech. But again, I would just like to perhaps highlight some very important issues to you. And that is that, this statement is long overdue, because we realized that editors and peer reviewers are not recognized when there are some evaluations for tenure or for promotion or anything at universities. And I think sort of the almost resistance that we received from some council members within ASSAf was indicative of sort of the environment out there in which editors and peer reviewers operate, and that it was not going to be a very easy road. So we are absolutely delighted that this was actually then approved, as it really sort of, we hope that it paves the way for much better understanding of the work that editors and peer reviewers would do. It's not just only aimed on books, but it is also aimed at journal editors, etc. So that was quite a change, is to have this combination of this approval as such. And that is very important. But before I delve too deeply into the statement, and as said, we're welcome and we could share it afterwards with all the participants in this meeting. And I would like to go over now to actually introduce then our speaker of the day. So this is Professor Keyan Tomaselli, and he's a distinguished professor in the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Johannesburg. He's an Emeritus Professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, where he's also a sometime fellow. He's a laureate fellow of the International Archaeological Institute, and an honorary member of the South African Communication Association. Professor Tomaselli is also the editor and co-editor and the founder of the Journal of African Cinemas, and then the co-editor of Critical Arts, South North Culture and Media Studies. Tomaselli has served as a president of the South African Communication Association and as a council member of the International Association for Semiotic Studies. Additionally, he serves on book series boards for Michigan State University Press and University of Toronto Press. I can also mention that Professor Keyan Tomaselli is the chairperson of our Committee of Scholarly Publications in South Africa, which advises the scholarly publishing program at the Academy of Sciences in terms of the work it should be doing and sort of the direction it should be taking. Professor Tomaselli, I am going to hand over to you to start your presentation. You're welcome to share, and then we can also listen whether we can hear you clear and well. Over to you, sir. So colleagues, while Professor Tomaselli is trying to rejoin, just want to mention that he was scheduled to give this presentation at our annual general meeting of the Academy of Science of South Africa. And also then we had some technical problems, so I do hope that this is not the case right now, because that's why we're having this meeting a second time, but at least this time around, we could have invited far and broad to participate in this particular meeting. So welcome to those that have just joined. I can see that the numbers are still growing in terms of the participants.
While everybody waits, Susan, I have posted the link to the statement in the chat box. So it is there for everybody to read if they want to access it.
Thank you very much, Ina. That is quite handy for us. Thank you.
Okay, I'm now back. Apologies.
Oh, fantastic. You've got sound and everything, Prof. That's wonderful. I just didn't want to call the big feet to for the technical issues to
now my PowerPoint has disappeared. I don't know what's going on here. It's a conspiracy.
Prof, can you, there you go, it's coming. No, please just share your...
Okay, maybe you could just put it up yourself. You've got the PowerPoint,
yes,
and then
can,
I'll tell you when to...
certainly we can do that. If you can just stop sharing, please.
Okay. All right, so if you could share the PowerPoint, I'll direct you through it.
I just want to check. Maputi, are you going to share it, or can I proceed?
Okay, I will share, Susan. I have it open.
Thank you very much. Please proceed.
Okay, while we're looking for the PowerPoint, I'm pleased that we have a backup sitting with ASSAf. Some background to the talk. I think many of us who started off as editors 20, 30, 40, maybe even 50 years ago, and who also were authors of a much smaller range of journals during those periods, really never got to grips with the value chain within which we were operating. We simply assumed that publication happens and that our papers appeared, and then we moved on to the next project. But as an editor, one is constantly negotiating institutional and, in the South African case, national policies in trying to maneuver through all sorts of conditions in ensuring that one's journal survives. And the journals in the 80s, of course, were very much of a cottage industry style, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, though in the sciences they might have been much more formal. So we're working under different political economy conditions and different funding models and so on. But the confusion or the ASSAf introduced the NSEF annual meetings where we discussed many matters relating to publication, and Robin Crew, especially as head of the committee, introduced us to all kinds of new models. Some of them were bewildering, some of them are now actually in operation, and others have been refined and adapted and adopted. But it was really the 2016 Stellenbosch conference on the future of scholarly publication, where we began to get a handle on this baggy monster that we had created in South Africa and in which we really didn't understand. So that's the background to that's the informal background to the more formal talk. And thanks again to Susan for the background. She's given a very prescient and in fact truncated discussion of the 2.5 years it took us to reach agreement on a 1.5-page document, which tells you how much peer review was going on. So we learned a lot also in that particular process in trying to interact with the full range of editors in South Africa on coming up with a document with which most, if not all, could actually agree to. So the first part of my talk will be on editor-author relations, the second part, editor-regulator-administrator relations, and then editing as enabling group formation. Next slide. On editor-author relations, Gerard van den Heever's exasperated open letter is addressed to scattergun authors who swamp his journal. This letter was published in the ASSAf magazine, the Academic and Non-Fiction Association of South Africa magazine. He says, "Dear author, I would like to believe that you submitted to this journal because you have been impressed by the quality of its articles and because it is the best venue from which to communicate with your envisaged academic audience. Why then did you not read the aims and focus of the journal? Instead, you submitted an article that falls outside its scope. Moreover, you ignored the instructions for authors. You create the impression, therefore, that your article is just doing the rounds." And I think that's a common experience amongst editors across the world. And a panel discussion at the 2021 National Scholarly Editors Forum examined the question of why academics edit and or peer review journals and books, and why this work, as Susan has pointed out, tends to be under-recognized. And this is what the ASSAf statement tries to rectify. Next slide, please. So editors are the quality assurance drivers of the entire knowledge enterprise. They collaborate with peers to produce new knowledge and exchange between authors and readers. Publishers provide the necessary systems, thereby empowering scholarly communities to function for public benefit. And discussion on South Africa's unique research and publication value chain, however, mostly focuses on a single component, the incentive administered by the Department of Higher Education and Training. And one of the things that I've been doing as chairman of this committee is to have started reading the early formation documents going back to the old SAPSI system and then the new system that was developed after 1994 and which began to be implemented in the early 2000s. And there's an extraordinary wealth of intellectual effort and contribution made by the previous generation of scholars from all disciplines in developing the current South African national publication quality framework, which is administered by the Department of Higher Education and Training, DHET, and in conjunction with ASSAf, which offers the evaluative oversight on quality of content. So the 1.5-page ASSAf statement, as pointed out, whose fastidious compilation was led by Philip de Jager, took 2 years to formulate in a digital world that is unraveling at breakneck speed. We're barely able to keep up with new technologies, new arguments, new studies, new systems, new software, new ways of doing things. And while it takes 2.5 years to write a statement, everything has changed by the time it is actually approved. Although I think that this statement is quite generic and therefore should be relevant for a long time. So let me now return to editor-regulator administrator relations. As mentioned, the state-funded Bureau of Scientific Publications, operative between the late 1970s and 2001, provided centralized editorial production and marketing for 20 journals whose impact factors nevertheless remained low. So despite the infrastructure, financial support, and state policy, the model wasn't really working that well. Next slide, please. So ASSAf and the then Department of Arts, Culture and Science and Technology devised a new community-responsive publication strategy to address the unfolding post-apartheid political, ideological, and technological policy environments. And this very extensive, comprehensive, and well-thought-out policy aimed to firstly promote the local and international standing of South African journals, improve productivity and efficacy via new digital platforms. Digitization was on the horizon, and popularize knowledge for public benefit. And the outcomes included the stabilization and professionalization of journals, measurably enhancing the global exposure of local scholarship after 2005. Journal titles, for example, increased from 236 in 2005 to 337 today, while the volume of accredited articles skyrocketed from 6,661 in 2005 to 26,017 by 2022. And it was during this period also that 76 local journals licensed themselves mainly via UNISA Press to Taylor and Francis, that has an office in Cape Town and which embraces a wider consortium that includes MedFarm and National Inquiry Scholarly Services. Now, this partnership that emerged from a project piloted by the National Research Foundation and UNISA Press from the early 2000s catapulted these journals into the global arena, securing them long-term sustainability. There's a whole story about the reason it took almost 8 years for that project to kick into place because of the international changes and buyouts and mergers and acquisitions that were going on internationally, also in relation to digitization and new technologies and software. But so as the 2006 ASSAf report suggested, working with professionals frees editors from the 100 technical, administrative, and legal things that publishers must do to keep the presses rolling, so to speak. Next slide, please. So the founding ASSAf strategists had presciently warned of emergent electronic publication, enabling easy journal proliferation and what they called an associated avalanche of published rubbish. Well, we've seen that come to pass, especially in the predatory sector. Digitization, feared ASSAf, could act also as a lifesaver for weak titles. Indeed, the current over-provision of local journals in some disciplines do stress DHET funds. Again, the ASSAf report of 2006 also cautioned against a publish or perish culture underpinning appointment, promotion, recognition, and institutional budgeting. Now, internal reward systems devised by different universities drawing on the DHET incentive need to keep in mind the procedures that characterize the conventions of normal science. The consequence of institutional economies that focus on, for example, billable units discourages young academics from editorial activity and writing engagements. So how are we going to reproduce ourselves? Overproduction in pursuit of incentives is questioned by the National Research Foundation, and ASSAf evaluation panels as seriously stressing quality, while the burden of review falls to a shrinking pool of overwhelmed by the growing tsunami of submissions. Just this morning, Louise from ASSAf circulated a paper which pointed out that the number of articles per employed researcher has skyrocketed, but the number of researchers has not. So therefore, we are not engaging in slow scholarship. We're engaging in fast scholarship and sending out products which are creating noise in the wider environment instead of actually having a direct impact on what it is that we do. So moreover, the just arrived elephant in the room, artificial intelligence, enables mass machine-produced output, portending the decentering and maybe even the death of autonomous human authors. If we accept that editing and reviewing are central to the scholarly enterprise, then some of the contradictions that arise are, next slide, please. University key performance indicators rarely recognize editorial activities, yet journals are the conduit to universities for DHET annual publication incentive transfers of 3.4 billion. Journals and publishers take the risk as they invest in evaluation and production, distribution and marketing, and hosting in perpetuity. Next slide, please. It is the journals, less so authors, that are subject to periodic ASSAf auditing because it is their accreditation status that confers value on outputs, both symbolic and financial. So the further contradiction, therefore, is that authors, no matter article quality or use value, are well rewarded via the universities, while it is the journals, i.e. the editors and reviewers, that shape, produce, and disseminate the published product. Yet the fundamental work done by editors, boards, peer reviewers, and publishers is inexplicably often blinded, with editors assumed by authors, administrators, and auditors to simply be filing clerks. Hence the ASSAf statement. So what do editors actually do? There's a wonderful web page called The Scholarly Kitchen, reports daily. It hosts a page titled 102 Things Journal Editors Do. This ever-lengthening document, like hundreds of websites addressing this question, however, elide the bigger picture, the conceptual in relation to the logistical. Next slide, please. Okay, with regard to the conceptual, responsive editors thus help to establish whole fields of inquiry and hybridize existing ones. They shape disciplines, change paradigms, and lead the academic enterprise. They recruit epistemic communities and connect them with each other, mentor successive generations in researching, writing, and peer review. They generate communities of interest, that is, knowledge clubs of authors, readers, and policymakers, consolidating problem solving around pressing issues. Next slide, please. Editors get a bird's eye view, both the good and the bad, valuable for the editor's own development as they plot conceptual routes and keep sight of historical epistemological roots. Good editors and reviewers nurture, enable, and educate. And we all know that there are reviewers who act as policemen, and they're going to make sure your article doesn't get published no matter what. Well, I think that we need to balance the enabling with the helpful criticism. Reviewers protect against junk science, AI opportunism, and predatory authors. We talk about predatory journals. Let's not forget all those authors out there trying to pull the wool over the editor's eyes. Some of them get through. Good reviewers and editors point a manuscript in new directions, ask questions, and are acknowledged para-authors. So finding truth involves both an accumulation of discrete case studies as products, but also in piloting relational collaborations. Editors and reviewers assist in connecting the dots. Good editors work with their authors in developing their manuscripts, and editors support universities in terms of the knowledge project, which is the original purpose of the university. Hence, editors should be taken seriously. So journals are phases in iterative processes. They are not objects, products, or consumables. Next slide, please. Okay, the transmission product display publishing model basically involves one-to-many linear dissemination of information. Next slide, please. But in contrast, the knowledge club model, which is how journals often started, constitutes publishing as dynamic, multifaceted scholarly group formation, often also grounded within disciplinary associations and particular schools of thought. So knowledge club members thereby form self-constituted communities of interest. They confer externalities, that is, unpriced components that are symbolically beneficial on associates of scholarly communities that produce, circulate, and debate pooled knowledge. Next slide. As such, knowledge is always in motion, building capacity, critical mass, and neural networking. The knowledge club model encourages self-reflexive analysis and participation in each other's dialectically grounded intellectual action with evidence-led practices. The club mediates debates, epistemological differences, and conceptual contestations. Okay, this slide has got a bit out of order. Okay, such interaction is crucial in the current alienated environment of industrial-scale mega journals and mass author markets that gobble up and frame research outputs as atomized and disciplinary alienated products, paid for by the author but free to the dispersed reader or consumer. I think one of the things that astonishes me is how often our early career scholars fall for the predatory invitations from journals they never heard of, from editors they don't know, maybe they don't even have surnames, from publishers that are unknown, that have IP addresses but not street addresses. And they respond to these positively. What's happened to the club model? Why are our early career authors and graduate students scrambling for anything that comes into their mailbox, but not working through the pre-existing club structures? So the local disciplinary commons needs restoration, and that's where the predators have filled the space and recruited underprepared scholars. Next slide, please. Okay, so the club model embraces intellectual cultures and member benefits. Scholarly communities shape publishing institutions to suit their own needs. The club model involves pooled codes and peer-based knowledge sharing activities. The model regards knowledge as club goods produced and consumed by specific niches, and joint production and consumption by the scholarly community create an economics of team production and consumption. We are reading each other's work. We are writing with each other. We are engaging each other. We are contesting each other. So the model constitutes a collective based around the formation of self-interested and coordinated groups. Now, the two models can subsist in the same journal, but creative tension can be generated between them and should be. We should not forget the need for dialectical reasoning, for debate, research letters, commentaries, book reviews, and so on. So such management and interaction are crucial in the current alienated environment of industrial-scale mega journals. These have constituted mass author markets that gobble up and frame research outputs as atomized product. That product is paid for, as I pointed out, but is free to dispersed reader, and they get lost. I know scholars in my own area, one of my own areas of research, who publish in conference proceedings of conferences that are not necessarily linked to disciplinary organizations, and those conference papers just disappear. The assumption is that if one clicks on Google, AI, that those papers will be found. Not necessarily, because you've got to have a diagnostic ability to look for what you want to find on the web. So megatextual proliferation intensifies noise rather than meaning. As Umberto Eco, the Italian philosopher, argued, information oversupply silences the relevance of information that we ought to have. He adds, to make noise, you don't have to invent stories. All you have to do is to report a story that is real but irrelevant. And then topic mega journal mode, whether publicly or corporately owned, mutes synergistic group formation. The scholars might lose themselves in the overwhelming digital mass. So recentering scholarly communities would include reading, commenting, book reviewing, research letters, and symptomatic editorializing as key components, as is done by the South African Journal of Science, which was the model that was devised by the early research and publication policy planners, the late 90s and early 2000s, as the model. So that's one of the reasons why when your journal is being evaluated by the ASSAf panel, that they ask questions about the add-on value of your journal. It's not just a place where research articles are published, but is it a place where there is a conversation going on through a variety of means and a variety of genres and entries? And so please do, if you haven't looked at the South African Journal of Science, please do. It's an eminently readable magazine, journal. It's aimed at a broader than just technical science readership, and it serves that readership too. And it really is a very good model on which to base one's own journal and to help constitute that club within the ambit of the journal. Next slide, please. Okay, best practice guidelines need to include the club dimension of a journal's living conceptual phases. The periodic ASSAf journal panel evaluations can track continuous reorganization, rebirth, and revitalization, such as is reflexively reported by the editors of Tydskrif vir Letterkunde, the South African Historical Journal, and the current number of the South African Journal of Science, where the entire volume is dedicated to a history of the 120-year life of the journal, the phases that it has gone through, the shifts that it has made, the ownerships that have come and gone, and what has been learned through that particular process. So we need to be aware of the history of our own publication, as well as answering the questions from the ASSAf panels on what we are currently doing today. And I think a self-reflexive analysis, a critical self-reflexive analysis of our own editorial and peer review and publication practices can only help to keep the journal current, innovative, and future-orientated. So such dynamism is insufficiently recognized by one-size-fits-all best practice statements. These statements need to connect the conceptual with the administrative, the theory building with the self-identified constituencies, the authors, readers, users, and knowledge creation with dialogue beyond the discrete standalone article. Editors should be understood as innovators, creators, and conceptual capacity builders within special interest knowledge clubs, enabling interpretive communities to dialogue with each other. And these are among the reasons why the ASSAf editor statement is so important. It repositions editors and reviewers as the enablers of public conceptual innovation. It recognizes editors as navigators towards new symbolic worlds. And crucially, the statement inserts editor and reviewer value, next slide, within an official value chain that currently undervalues them. Crucially, the statement valorizes editor knowledge as a fundamental intellectual cognate, while embracing the technical journal administration, but is not reduced to those 102 technicalities. So to conclude, editors and reviewers are the co-guardians of what Teilhard de Chardin identified as the Earth's thinking envelope, dealing daily with the impatient, not so hypothetical author who is the recipient of van den Heever's further caution. He says, before you fire off angry letters of demand to know when you can expect publication of your submitted article, just spare a moment to think of the immense amount of work that goes into making each issue of this journal. Research is not the impressionistic stitching together of references, citations, reports, and opinions. So editors are the heart of the knowledge enterprise, and they also need to be nurtured, recognized, and acknowledged by both authors and institutions. So editors, next slide. Editors as conceptual shapeshifters are perhaps what the founders of the mid-2000s National Research Framework had in mind. And I think I can say that quite confidently, having read all of the books, reports, articles, and technical documents that were generated during that period, and many of which are listed on the ASSAf website. And at the 120-year celebration of the journal a few days ago, we had time to rub shoulders with Wieland Gevers, one of the key planners from the late 90s and early 2000s. And I spent the day with him flying back to South Africa when we put these, when we discussed these matters at length. So there's a resource, an elderly resource that we can still draw on, thankfully, to contextualize what seems to us to be, in a synchronic sense, just a series of rules and regulations which sometimes get in the way, or we think they get in the way of our activity and practice. But in fact, they have a long history of philosophical gestation. So to return to the Relational Club organization, the Relational Club organization is adeptly supported in the extensive infrastructure provided by the globally unique ASSAf Special Publication Program. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. This is South Africa's contribution globally. So national policy offers via this program both the practice-led philosophy and the well-managed organizational structure to support the various publishing models that are now in operation. I think that when we are teaching our students, particularly honors, MA, and PhD students, that we need to be explaining to them also not just how to get published or how to select an appropriate journal, which very few early career scholars have any idea about, or how to write. We should be teaching them about the national value chain and how South Africa has created something that is unique and that has met its objectives in terms of exposure of local work globally, the stabilization of local journals, although it has been less successful in elevating the local journals into global contexts. So these are issues that are that are also discussed in the panel evaluations. So those panel evaluations are not just auditing activities, they also feed back into national policy and to ways of doing things that strengthen the whole process. And the whole point of this is we have to take this seriously. and stop gaming the system. And we need to create the system and look after it and build its capacity. So let me then end with this comment that knowledge is not the sum of all articles published, but of the interactive potentialities that arise from them as living documents in constant negotiation with each other that circulate meaning-making between editors, authors, and readers. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Professor Tomaselli. Thank you very much for contextualizing the statement and sort of recognizing the work of peer reviewers and editors, and especially editors, in being an editor of a particular journal or of a book for that matter. I cannot, there was a hand up, but that person took his hand down. So I will allow for participants to raise their hands. Sorry, I just want to make sure. I mean, there are 218 participants on this call, and I just want to make sure that it's orderly. So please, can by the raise of hands, if you would like to ask your question live, then please just raise your hands. But in the meantime, there has been just a comment in the chat box about CPD points for scholarly journals and articles to add value to their professional development and to incentivize participation. And the question then was, does that happen, that editors and reviewers actually can register for sub-CPD points to be acknowledged in their in the evaluations, etc.? So some are saying yes, there is, but any views from your side, Prof?
Yeah, well, of course, we know that editors are not recognized. Editorial work is not recognized by DHET. Editorial work may be recognized by some universities, which perhaps give the editor teaching relief or perhaps a stipend to actually edit a journal. One, of course, can put that, one can tick off editing work on NRF applications, and I think the NRF rating applications do take editing seriously. But my argument is that we need to introduce into our individual university performance management contracts the additional KPIs of editing and peer reviewing. There should be an expectation that every qualified scholar, I guess, who's got a master's, PhD, or beyond, commits to reviewing 4 articles a year to take the pressure off the declining pool of overworked and aging voluntary peer reviewers. So there are ways that one can secure symbolic benefit, even if the structure does not specifically identify editing and peer reviewing as a incentive-bearing product. And I think, quite frankly, this is part of our job. Okay, there's a whole big debate, especially led by an economist called Sean Miller, who talks about the perverse effects of incentives, and we need to return to normal science where we consider ourselves an interacting community of inter-supporting scholars rather than expecting payment for doing work that is part of our job description. But it needs to become part of our job description. That's the point. Thank you.
Thank you. And you have also now answered our second question from Rob Morrell that asks whether you can suggest some ways that universities may begin to reward editorial and reviewer work. If I can jump in here, if I may, and that is from an editor's point of view, there are some attempts to at least reward reviewers by perhaps on an annual basis award prizes for reviewers for best review in that particular year, or sometimes their names are published to give sort of public recognition of the work they have done. Those are the sort of the quick ways, the more subtle ways I must also just mention, if we get to open peer review, where the identities of reviewers then gets known to the author, etc., that is still met with some sort of negativity and a reluctancy to actually also put their names into the particular articles that they've reviewed for very specific reasons. And I'm not going to dwell on them. We can, if we have enough time, perhaps talk a little bit about it. But just to mention that there are those sort of subtle ways, but not necessarily from the university point of view. But I do like your point that you've raised, Keyan. Thank you. That you have raised that actually.
Yeah, just one more point about that. I mean, good peer
Yes,
review.
please, Chris.
Yeah, if I can just finish off that point. Good peer reviewers are noticed by editors. Reliable peer reviewers are noticed by editors. Fastidious peer reviewers who try to help the author are appreciated by editors, and the peer reviewers may then find themselves invited onto the editorial boards. And that then is another leg up into greater exposure and connection into the pooled community. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. And then just a comment there from Vicky Tolmay to say that science councils also have this exact problem that we have been discussing, etc. Yes, of course, Vicky, indeed, that is true. I am going to take a hand or two now before I move back into the questions. Roshan, do you want to perhaps try and pose your question? I see that you've been enabled.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'm so glad we're having this discussion, because when I looked at the statement, I did think, how do we put this into practice now? Because it is a very good statement. So, and I like some of the suggestions that you made. So I'm just wondering, so I'm talking from book publishing, but obviously it also applies to journals in a way. So from publishers and I guess libraries that do publishing within their universities, should publishers be lobbying with the research officers? Or should we also be taking this further up to ASSAf, for example, where, all the vice chancellors are, and that is a bigger body, so might have more influence. I'm just wondering around that strategy. And then secondly, just around the quality of the peer review, and how to reward that, because I'm also worried, like, let's just say it is rewarded, and then we fall into a whole nother trap of gaming the system, because you get 2 reviews and often one review is very good and what Keyan was saying, detailed and really taking the work seriously, and then another review is very thin. And how do you then start to measure quality, which is also part of this process of reward that I think we need to consider. And I wonder if there's space for training, to do training, with people on what is expected in a peer review report and some guidelines. So those are just some comments, some questions. But yeah, if you could respond to the ASSAf thing in particular.
Well, one of the objectives of publishing the editor statement was to set or to reset or even shift the national agenda. Now, the interesting point here is that the National Research Foundation, the CHE, ASSAf and DHET all subscribe to the philosophy that we've just discussed this morning. The problem occurs inside individual public universities where the policy and the philosophy is reconstituted, perhaps even rearticulated into balance sheet calculations. So the constant exhortation for authors to reach more and more targets, to publish more and more, publish, and perish, is counter-indicated from that national policy. So the statement now gives a benchmark through which can be used to mainstream a shift of attitudes and a shift of practices and a shift of administrations and a shift of expectations from the departmental level upwards through departments, schools, faculties, Senate, into the administration. The administration's job is to set targets and to calculate outputs and income. It's a balance sheet operation. Got to manage the whole process. So they work under different assumptions to academics who perhaps want to engage in slow scholarship, clear thinking, and publish an article or submit an article only when they think it has reached perfection, as opposed to the garbage that comes in to journals every night. I mean, my own journal, we're dealing with 20 to 30 submissions a night. 98% are desk rejected because the author, to remember what Van Heerden said, didn't bother to work out whether this is an appropriate journal, has not studied the journal. So we need to train up our supervisors, we need to train up our students how to select a journal. Then they expect an immediate turnaround. So then we need to run peer review workshops. Now, the universities, to my knowledge, are not really that fixated on doing peer review education. They're concerned about getting published. It's the publishers that are now running peer review workshops. So we've got to mainstream this from the bottom up and the top down. And we've got to start shifting the attitudes of the different constituencies within universities, the academics, the students, the administrators, and top management. And that has already started through the DHET ASSAf publication framework project being conducted from Stellenbosch University's CREST, and meetings have already occurred with vice-chancellors and with senior research administrators in terms of trying to get them to understand what the philosophy is and to come up with appropriate responses within universities that enable top quality, internationally cutting-edge research, and to mute the gaming of the system and to remove the noise from the system. Too many articles are writing about the same thing and we're learning nothing. It's just cluttering the airwaves. It's cluttering the internet. So we need to get back to quality. The DHET objective of increased research has occurred, but the CREST data is suggesting there's a decline in quality as that occurs. Okay, the second point, Roshan, was peer reviewing. Oh yeah, contradictions in peer review. One reviewer says publish with minor correction. The other one says reject, never consider this again. What do you do? That's a problem that every editor has to deal with, and that raises all kinds of problems. It takes time. We have to find other reviewers, and in looking at the international literature, with the decline of people willing to review, some articles are taking up to 10, 20, 30, 40 invitations before a reviewer agrees to review. Now, that could take 6 months, it could take 9 months, it could take 2 years. And then the reviewer doesn't deliver. So one brings in adjudicators, and those are the people on the editorial boards who are now finding themselves not contributing to policy and creativity and knowledge innovation, but are now refereeing, peer reviewing reports and trying to help the author. And the publishers, in the age of AI and predatory environment, are becoming more and more demanding that you have to have 2 accepted peer reviews. You cannot have one, and the editor have the discretion to make the final decision. So I think the editor statement is saying, put some of that discretion back into the role of the editor. The editor is the expert. The editor has the bird's eye view. The editor has shaped a discipline. We can trust them. And some reviews, as we know, are useless. Other reviews, so that these things have to be ranked, and others are mean and destructive. Just get rid of those. Although sometimes it's necessary to pass those on to the author so that they can anticipate a further attack down the line when that destructive reviewer sees the article in print, whether or not that article has been revised. So there's a down the line consequence if the author hasn't actually responded to that particular reviewer. And then what was the last point you made? I can't read my writing here, Roshan.
I think you have answered most of it, Keyan. I think one of her comments were, "What about USAF? What do we do?"
Oh,
How
yes,
do
yes. No,
we-"
well, I mean, USAF is part of that value
Yes.
chain that we need to start with.
Yes.
The individual author, department, school, faculty, Senate, USAF, ASSAf, DHET. This is a dialogue. And, if I can just go back into the history of my participation of the NSF meetings, especially when they were face-to-face, and hopefully we'll get back to that in due course, where 300 people would turn up to that meeting and they pay their own way to that meeting. Now we're lucky if we get 90 on a video link, although today is a bit different. The point is that initially we were kind of all finding our feet, and ASSAf was a little bit prescriptive, perhaps, laying down the law because it was dealing with the Wild West arising out of the 80s and 90s. So we had to bring some stability had to occur. And I think that editors came to protect their own interests. Then the ground was shifted and ASSAf became much more consultative. And now the editors are making the policy or suggesting policy, which then is passed on to DHET. And DHET makes the final decision because they are the legislative authority. We are not, but we can make these, we can shape the nature of the debate, and we can ask them to think about particular issues that are bothering us. So so ASSAf has become a club. NSF is a club. It's operating exactly as it was intended, but it's taken us a while to get to this point because we needed to get the buy-in of editors to see this process as helpful, as capacity building, and as future orientated rather than as a policing exercise. And I'll admit that there have been issues in the past with some panels where journals have objected quite vociferously to some of the conclusions that have been drawn, and we're dealing with those and tweaking the questionnaire and the kind of data that we'd like future panel evaluators to obtain from the journals. The metrics is one of those. For example, it's not the be all and end all, but it's helpful. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Prof. So let's just return a little bit to the questions and answers. I'm trying to be fair here, just to make sure that we get a good balance of questions being asked. I see there is some comments, but I would like to move a little bit towards the one about younger scholars. So Numbulelo Shangi said that, how do younger scholars balance the challenge between the desire to produce impactful work and the quota-driven approach many universities move towards? Most of the push is also towards high-impact journals, which are often Western journals. So when balancing wanting to grow your career and also wanting to make more meaningful contribution, this becomes a big challenge. I'm not sure if you want to comment on that.
Yes,
question.
of course, I'll comment on it. Firstly, the quota system must be thrown out the window. We must produce work that is symbolic, that is good, that is clear, and only submit for publication when it is ready for publication. As an editor, I can assure you it's very irritating when one is faced let me just give an example here to concretize what has been asked. A couple of years ago, NSEF approached UJ to ask my journal, Critical Arts, to work with it to produce a special issue authored by postdoctoral fellows. They offered a 1-year budget. We said we need 2 years because it's going to take that long. The average top academic might take 18 months from submission to actual publication. So why are we, why do we think that postdocs are so much better than the experienced? But anyway, it ended up as a 1-year project, and the journal and the university carried the cost for the rest. Call for papers were sent out across the country. POPI had just been enacted, and many universities simply refused to cooperate with the call for papers, or even to sub-circulate that call for papers within their own postdoctoral community. They overinterpreted the act. So the result was that the editors come from UKZN and UJ, and the NIHS sent out their own call for papers, and we, of all the thousands of postdocs across the country in humanities and social sciences, we got 38 abstracts submitted. Of the 38, only 22 were considered viable, and we assumed that of the 22, there would be an attrition of another 4 or 5 that would not be, the papers would not reach publishable standard. Well, here's where the contradiction kicked in big time, because our assumption in working with the authors whose abstracts had been accepted for development into a full paper was that they would be working with their supervisors. They would be working with their colleagues. They would be working with their universities. And of the 16 articles that were finally published over a 2-year period, only 3 of the submitted articles did not need 18 months of intensive training and support and multiple peer reviewing, sometimes going into the 4th peer review to get published. The rest all complained about the fact that they were expected to undertake substantial corrections on the first draft, substantial corrections on the second draft, to revisit the corrections that were suggested on the first and second reports, and so on. This was completely new to them. The fact that you write an article, you don't just write the first draft and submit it. In my own case, I'll write a draft 30, 40 times. In their case, they want to do it once, twice. But the kicker came in when one of the authors said that she would have to withdraw the paper after Taylor and Francis, NIHSS, University of Johannesburg, Critical Arts must have invested 20, 30,000 rands of time and effort into helping that author who was not getting that support from her own university. She said she had to withdraw it and put it into a backyard journal because she hadn't met her departmental target or quota. That is what DHET is trying to eliminate. That is what is bothering ASSAf. So even when the support is provided, it's clear to us that that with the massification of graduate students, that the pressures on them, the lack of institutional understanding of the conditions under which they're working, leads them to be anxious, leads them to have unrealistic expectations. And so it's not just about how to get published, it's about how to be an academic, how to be a good scholar. That's what we need to focus on to return to the knowledge project rather than the product display project.
Thank you, Prof. Michael van Wyk, your microphone has been enabled. Please proceed with your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Susan. Prof Tomaselli. In my early years, I was never empowered how to do peer review. It was through trial and error that I started off. I did not know where to start. But as I grow into peer review, I become more interested in each of the manuscripts sent to me. So the manuscript is a new story that I read first. Secondly, I look at the scientific merit of the paper, and I look at the research methodology section, which is aligned to what your results are saying. Are you thumbs at your results, or is your result fake, or is the true reflection? So through that, I have learned that. So my question is to you: is ASSAf busy with a particular course for beginners peer reviewers, as well as informing them established peer reviewers to deliver these courses over time to your early career researchers? Because your early career researchers can benefit from this peer review strategy that ASSAf can then implement in the field. And at universities, academics are so busy because there's no time for them to go to these peer review sections unless the university have a dedicated person. In myself, I'm passionate about, because every article is a new story, as I said. It gave me a new glimpse of how the writer is expressing himself in his arguments in the paper. And finally, some of the journal editors use a AI detector tool to first peer review the manuscript to check whether it's written by an AI bot. Secondly, to see what is the quality. Is that ethically to use AI generated tools to use it as a peer review tool? Because I know some of the journals do it currently. So I would like to have your take on that. Thank you.
Okay, two very different questions, Michael, and your response is music to my ears. And yes, as I pointed out, the publishers are now running peer review webinars, and I think ASSAf does that too. Susan, is that correct?
Yes, we do through our South African Journal of Science. At the moment, just once a year, but we do try and advertise it as broad as we can. That also, sorry if I might jump in here, I see that it also relates to a question that Professor De Jager has asked, is what do peer reviewers want to hear when they get trained? So just keep that on the back burner, perhaps. Please proceed.
Okay, so just think of it in this way. Okay, I mean, yeah, we all have to start somewhere, and if we haven't gone through a course, well, we have to develop by intuition. Peer reviewing is not that different from external examining or internal examining, or assessing an essay. So it's the same set of skills, but with a different outcome. So that's what we can actually draw on. And I just loved your story, Michael, of every article is a new story. That's precisely the attitude that we should be looking at, because what can we, the peer reviewer, learn from an article that we are evaluating? And very often, even if I reject an article, which is not often because one tries to give the author the opportunity to revise, but that depends on the journal policy. Some journals only have a one-time policy, and others will have a more development policy and maybe go to 3 or 4 revisions. What can I learn? And very often I learn from what I'm reading, whether the article is good or bad, because it's a different story that has been told by somebody I don't know about in a context that may or may not be identified. So it becomes an interaction. That's, again, it's that club ethos that helps us, as well as the author that we're evaluating. So I do, as the other thing you made was the stress on our time. Let me give a comparison. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Europe consulting for an Academy of Science, and we were looking at research centers across the country, and the quality and the capacity of these research centers was just mind-boggling. One center amongst many, 200 books in 5 years. And there were 70 people part of that organization, 500 chapters, 1,000 articles, video things, video productions, educational movie. It was just mind-boggling. I mean, whether or not that output had an impact, whether it was inequality, I don't know. But what became clear was that academics in Europe are much better supported by the institutions. They're not overwhelmed with bureaucracy. They're not subverted by inefficient bureaucracy. The systems work. The administrators are supportive. They're not playing ideological games. They're not looking at quotas, or they're looking at output certainly, but not looking at quotas or issues that get in the way of daily work. That's how those centers manage to produce to the extent that they do, and it completely swallows up, the global outlets. So we need to, we've come through 30 years, we need of liberation. We need to now start stabilizing our institutions. putting in place systems that work, administrators that understand why they do what they do, and can explain the rules to academics rather than just saying that's the way it's done. There's got to be more internal communication within institutions about why do we do things in a particular way, what are the implications, what are the effects, good and bad, and how do we fix those? We're not doing that because everybody's just stuck in their own silo. So let me stop on that point. And then the issue of AI. Now, I think this is getting to be quite a tricky situation because AI suddenly appeared, about a year ago, and it's completely disrupted everything. Now, when you're a journal editor of PLOS One and you get 1,000 articles a night that have to be evaluated, you can't find 2,000 articles, 2,000 reviewers every day. Who's going to do that? So maybe some journals are using AI, and I think that's a very bad idea because AI is not a person. And once that article is fed into the AI computer, the repository, it becomes part of it. It's lost. The copyright is lost from the author. It's now in the AI repository and available to everybody else to be used as anybody wants. There's a wonderful article written by Hetta Pieterse, who is commissioning editor at UNISA Press in the ANFASA magazine I mentioned earlier. That's the Academic and Non-Fiction Authors Association magazine. I'll ask ASSAf to circulate that particular article, and she warns against that. So, in my journals, we stick with humans. We stick with humans that we can find, that we know, and that they exist. And we ask them not, well, we should be asking them not to put the article into AI. And I think that's the point that I will take away from this. Certainly, once the article is accepted, then it goes through an I-authenticate report with some publishers to check whether there's any residual plagiarism or mistakes or quotes that were forgotten that needed to be assigned. But treat AI with great caution. It can be helpful, but and there's another article in that same number of the journal that deals with copyright and IP issues, especially in relation to the South African Copyright Bill, which doesn't take account of AI, whereas the 1978 Copyright Act does. It's aware of it. It's aware of what's coming. The current bill, accepted by Parliament last year, but referred to the Constitutional Court by the President, does not recognize AI. This means that our intellectual property is under threat if that bill is enacted. And what are the consequences of that? There are some that say that's good because anybody can then read anything, and the author has no copyright ownership anymore, and that means that everybody can read for free, and it's called open science. But the legal debates are much more complicated than that. So my point is that if you, as an author, you use AI, then ethically you've got to acknowledge that in your paper. And I don't know what kind of detail might actually be requested by the publisher. But as a reviewer, I would stay away from use of AI, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Yes, just want to confirm that ASSAf has already published its guidelines for editors in the editorial process, when and how to make use of AI. And when not to make use of it. And definitely peer review is an absolute no-no, because you're right. These large language models work on the basis, whatever you feed them, it stays in the body of knowledge. And then, of course, you are contravening all the privacy and intellectual property rights and copyright issues of the author and of the journal as such. So please have a look at those guidelines. We can also send those to you that you can just have a look to see how AI could be used and how it definitely should not be used in your editorial processes. We've got 12 minutes left, Prof. So I would like to sort of combine two questions because I think they do relate to each other. Can I just also mention to our remaining participants that we will certainly look at the other questions and we will answer them on paper for you, and we will share it with everybody on this particular call as well. So we have an anonymous attendee, but this question also sort of then relates back to another question that Professor Morel also asked, to say that adding to the academic load has challenges. Most academics feel overworked. So he is interested in incentivizing review and editing work. Anonymous attendee also mentioned that to say that given that most of us have to write outside of work hours and that universities do not pay academics overtime, how do we justify a process that insists that even while academics are carrying more and more of the administrative load at universities, they should not expect to be paid in kind? And they can also no longer count on the research incentives to allow them to continue to work in kind. Will no incentive necessarily lead to better scholarship, especially also in light of universities' push towards quota-driven approaches? So I just thought we could see them alongside. So what are the other ways in recognizing that academics actually feel sometimes really overloaded and overworked? And to put this as a key performance area or evaluation criteria could even prove to be quite problematic.
Yeah, well, it goes back to the way that universities organize themselves and the policy coming down from government, state, councils, Senate. We've got to actually get our handle on our workspaces again. We've got to be able to balance the activities that we do in the jobs that we are employed in, and we've got to reduce the number of KPIs that we're expected to be perfectionists in. I was at a conference, a critical management studies conference yesterday, organized by the University of Johannesburg, and one of the deans pointed out that deans have 171 KPIs. Now, we all know the deans at UJ are very well supported in terms of administrative staff and backup and officers and teaching relief, but not research relief. It becomes impossible to meet all of those KPIs. So we're actually overloading ourselves, and the people overloading us are not ourselves. Or unless we as academics then become deans and administrators, and then we join that particular level of oversight, which then sends instructions down. Let me just go back again to my own experience at UKZN. I know about 30 years ago, when I was made a fellow of the university, all the fellows were summoned at short notice to a HR meeting, which was chaired by a consultant from the private industry who had worked out about 10 pages of criteria that senior professors and fellows were now subjected to on a daily basis. And, the meeting was boycotted by half the senior professors, and I went along out of curiosity. And I think there were 2 or 3 others there who were extremely irritated and angry. And we pointed out that this list of KPIs bore no relationship or very little relationship to what we actually do every day. And here we had a 30-year-old, consultant, not an academic, never worked in university, employed in private enterprise, probably working better with business, now telling professors, senior professors, how to do their jobs and what their jobs entail. This is the consequence of an unrestricted neoliberal tsunami that has hit all organizations across the world. And it doesn't matter whether you're capitalist or state capitalist like China or anywhere else. We're all subjected to these administrative oversights, irrespective of the value of our actual productivity. So it's not something that can be sorted out overnight. It's a structural problem that we have to deal with every day. So that's the first thing. And this statement is, in this particular sector, the first shot across the bows. With regard to the acknowledgement of the work done, well, I don't want to get paid for my peer review because I consider that to be part of my job, but then I'm very lucky because I'm fully employed. If you're retired, if you're underemployed, if you're part-time, you're fixed term, then that changes the ground a little bit, and therefore one does think that one needs to be paid, especially if one is working in one's own free time. But here's the problem, again, logistically. Okay, I'm a provisional taxpayer, and every 6 months I have to do my taxes, and I have, because I am invited to participate in a number of consultations, I get relatively small payments, 500, 200, maybe 1,000, maybe in some cases 10,000. All of these payments have to secure SARS compliance, IRP5 forms. Now you're dealing with accountants at the contractor who doesn't answer the email, who doesn't issue the right certificate, who can't get it right. And the result is I sit with 20 or 30 IRP5 forms, and I'm still trying to chase down 5, and it's 2 hours to go to submission. And once I've got more than 16 IRP5s, the SARS system kicks me out of the web. I have to go to the SARS office carrying a file of IRP5 forms. I could spend a day or 2 days there. And then they want to know, where's the missing one? I said, well, the missing one, here's my email correspondence asking for the IRP5 form. It didn't come on time. Well, that's a 2,000 Rand fine for me. So think about the unintended consequences of wanting to be paid relatively small amounts and the tsunami of IRP5 forms that are now going to be issued. So, again, I think the benefits are symbolic rather than financial. But I do take into account the fact that increasingly all of us are being asked to do more and more work, often with no pay, and some of it is quite extensive. For example, NRF rating evaluations can take a month to do, and there's no payment for that, although one hopes that when one applies for one's own rating, that the evaluators will put in the same investment and time and commitment to evaluating yours. And I think it comes down to this. I had a PhD student. I said to her, this is a brilliant thesis. We're going to get the world's best scholars to evaluate it, which we did. And two of the external examiners actually wrote like 20, 30 pages of engagement of that thesis. Okay, they were so taken with the thesis that it became a club-like interaction. And they spent far more time than they should have for what they got paid. But that was academic loyalty. When I asked that particular individual, student now graduated, to please review an article for a journal, I got back 3 lines. So what do you do with that? Now the person wants to get paid. You get the reviewer writes 5 pages of helpful work, and then you get one that's 3 lines long. You can't pay them the same. How do you actually rank it? And I went back and I said, look, remember those reviewers of your thesis and the effort that they put into your work? You now have to return the favor. It might not be to the examiners, but it's to people in the community, the club. Please take it seriously. Now redo the review, please. And she did.
Oh, goodness. Prof, I have a very quick question, I hope, and then I would like to conclude then the discussions. And there's been a question to say, what strategies would you recommend for early career researchers to build their credibility and confidence as peer reviewers, especially when reviewing for high impact journals or any other academic related writing? A quick answer, please, Prof.
The quick answer is work through your disciplinary association. Choose one that is local, that's closest to your interests, and one that is international. And then identify yourself to the journal editors that the local and international journals, the international associations produce. Work your way into their interest groups or their working groups and build your career through those particular structures. Too often what happens is that the early career scholars are just left hanging, swimming around in a pond, and they don't know where the exits are or how to get out of it. And that comes down back to the supervisor, to the department, to the faculty, and to the guidance that you should be getting from the older generation scholars who may not be offering it, because here is the problem. And this is the one problem with the DHET system, is that it privatizes the rewards. It de-incentivizes teamwork. We need to, and it mutes the club interaction. And it starts in the department. It starts with the leadership. It starts with your colleagues. That's where it's got to start. ASSAf can't answer those questions. It's got to start in situ, in the department, with your team, with your department, with your own university support structures. Over and out.
Thank you very much, Prof. And thank you for availing yourself for a second time around. I'm just so pleased that this time it really paid off and everything worked fine. And it is great. I think judging by the huge amount of questions not being answered yet, the need of this type of discussion in conversation with, because I think there's nothing that actually replaces this personal anecdotes that you've shared with us, as well as sort of the experience and the honest sort of reflection on the current system. I could see there are many questions about the current system and how do we reform that. Just want to confirm that, that ASSAf is slowly but surely sort of looking at these different issues, and also specifically under the Open Science banner, which also urges us to reform the research assessment system and to look at different criteria then when evaluating researchers, etc. So it's a long and maybe a challenging road ahead. But once again, our sincerest appreciation, Prof, for your leadership and for leading all this conversation and answering and fielding the questions. We appreciate. We also want to thank the participants. This has been great, huge numbers. So again, just confirms the interest in this particular subject. We'll try and see if we can do another webinar that sort of relates to this broad subject. Over to you,
okay,
Prof.
Thank you. Just
yes.
One more point. Okay, Susan
yes.
Veldsman is the face of the special publication program. That's the infrastructure that handles the national policy work and which interacts with the Department of Higher Education and Training. And that is a relationship that is working exceptionally well at the moment. Okay, it depends on who's the DG, it depends on all sorts of things as to whether that relationship, as to the nature of that relationship. It is working fantastically well at the moment, and we want to keep that going. Okay, behind Susan is a whole cadre of administrators and technical people and administrative people. I can see them all at the top of my screen here, who support all of us. They're not known, they're not seen because they're just working behind the scenes. Very much as do the employees of publishers. Behind every article published, there may be 10 to 20 people in the background, lawyers, typesetters, copy editors, marketers, web hosters, apart from the editors that are visible, making sure that your article is protected, is processed, is produced, and will be hosted in perpetuity. These are the invisible structures. It's like an iceberg. Behind every author is this 2/3 of the iceberg that is never known, never seen, never met, but with which editors deal with every day of their life. So I just wanted to say that we're in good hands. The publication framework project will continue for another 2.5 years. This is the time that we can actually work to shape policy and rules and regulations, and to ensure that the 10% who game the system don't asymmetrically draw off funds that should actually be dispersed across the whole system. That's all of us. So thank you again, Susan.
Thank you, and thank you for that acknowledgement. Do appreciate. Thank you, colleagues. I now close this meeting and looking forward to engage with you in the future again. Thank you. Goodbye.